You guys, hello and welcome. I just really wanted to show you guys white snakeroot over here. It's one of my favorite plants. I just got this one at the discount section for $5 earlier this year at the clearance section at my local nursery. It looked pretty rough when I first got it, but it's done amazing. It's really tall now. So this over here is Eupatorium rugosum, also known as chocolate white snakeroot. So snakeroots, this is not technically a true snakeroot. That's in a different genus that I'll put in the description video of the video, but that one's actually quite poisonous. This one over here is still toxic, but it's much more suitable for a landscape plant because its toxic effects are not very resonating and they're not very pronounced. But one thing I will say is I still do not recommend eating this plant. So this here is a herbaceous perennial. I'll just show you guys the base. They grow really well in pots. Has this really interesting, it almost looks like shisha or shisa, like the Japanese garnishing herb that you have in sushi sometimes, is kind of what the leaf looks like. Has a very serrated margin, it's very malleable and flexible. Has this really interesting chocolatey kind of purple colored stem to it, very heavily branched, and it has a mounding feature to it overall. It's a multi-stemmed plant. It's very woody. I highly recommend cutting it right back down to the ground after bloom. So the blooms on this plant are corymb in form. They're pretty tall actually. The bloom clusters are about this big. They're white, sometimes cream colored, a little bit aromatic, quite similar to a stilby. Planted in another one of my videos earlier as far as the bloom form is. It's very kind of feathery, really attracts hummingbirds and bees. It's just really beautiful. This plant here where I live blooms in September, October, and in some cases even into November. So it has this really nice autumnal interest to it because of that chocolate foliage and the really striking white cream colored blooms. So some of my tips for this plant is I highly recommend cutting it back, as I said earlier, in the fall. This one over here at the nursery, I don't know if you can see, they cut it back pretty generously down to about 2 inches from the ground surface. It died right back and created new canes. You can propagate these canes by yourself by simply dividing them. They have a lot of aerial roots as well. This plant will produce a few more lateral shoots for you if you prune it back, and you might get even more of a surplus of blooms, but you really compromise the height and texture of the plant when you prune it that way. You can also pretty readily root semi-hard softwood cuttings. I recommend doing that in about July, especially if you don't prune it the year before, because then you have a little bit more woody tissue to work with. This plant over here is usually about 4 to 6 feet tall. I have this one in a pot. This one's a little over 4 feet tall. It's just in a few gallon pot. Yeah, so it's very cold hardy. This is a very hard to kill plant. It likes relatively fertile soils. It likes soils that are somewhat wet but can readily drain, but they don't have to have exceptional drainage as long as it's not sitting in water. This plant here likes really regular watering during the summer, I've noticed. It wilts, it'll definitely tell you when it needs more water. It looks very unsightly and then it just pops right back up once you've watered it. Another thing I will say, it has little fruits. They're very sort of nondescript, green in color, not very interesting in my opinion. They're kind of a more subtle feature of this plant. And I want to talk about fall color. So this plant over here actually goes in nice green, kind of chartreuse, grapevine-y kind of medley of colors in the fall. It really shows those nice veins too. These look really good in bouquets too. You can cut them down and then just have one stalk and just use that kind of like you would eucalyptus in like a winter style bouquet. And that looks really nice too. So one thing I've noticed is this plant here likes a little bit of a higher pH level. I find that in soils that have about a pH of 6, this plant here tends to grow a lot quicker. It'll get a little bit stunted if your soil's a little too alkaline, I've noticed. And another thing I want to say is it's a really high nitrogen feeder. To achieve this big growth here, you need a lot of nitrogen in your soil. So I highly recommend mulching with maybe a little bit of grass and just detritus leaf material too. Very easy to divide, very forgiving plant, cold hardy to about -14 to -18 degrees Celsius. Definitely keep it under a little bit of protection during the winter, especially from wind. It's native to central and coastal parts of North America.